Atreyee Bhattacharya. Thank you all for joining and thank you for your patience. We shall begin sharp at 6:30 p.m. and we request all the participants in the meeting to keep their camera and microphone turned off throughout the meeting to avoid any interference. Please refrain from screen sharing and other such malpractices. And if you are facing problems in Microsoft Teams, you can join the lecture on YouTube live stream. the meeting to keep the camera and microphone turned off throughout the meeting to avoid any interference. Please refrain from screen sharing and other such malpractices. The session should not be recorded in any way. We expect everyone to abide by these protocols in order to ensure a smooth session. We shall be compelled to remove the respective participants in any case of malpractice. For the question and answer session, the attendees can put down their queries in the Microsoft Teams chat box. And for those who are watching us on YouTube Live, can drop their questions in the YouTube comment section. Our speaker will address them at the end of the session. So today we are extremely privileged to have with us Dr. Atreyee Bhattacharya, research faculty at the University of Colorado, speaking on the topic chronicling climate. Dr. Bhattacharya is an eminent paleoclimatologist with 7 years of experience in teaching and conducting research with undergraduate students in natural and affiliated disciplines seeking to engage with natural systems in the wake of the current climate crisis. A member of the National Association of Science Writers. She also has 12 years of experience as a science writer or a communicator. She has some 50 publications on a wide range of topics. It would not be quite wrong to call her an all-rounder who participates in a wide range of educational and non-governmental outreach efforts focused on climate communication, climate science curriculum, climate literacy, and climate adaptation. We are highly honored to have her with us as deliver a talk on such dynamic, enrapturing topic. She would be shedding light on reconstruction of climate variability and its impact over the late Holocene from high resolution indirect observation. We are sure that the session will be extremely enriching for each one of us. We'd like to hear some more about her from our very own professor, Anirban Chatterjee, Assistant Professor at the Department of Geology, Presidency University, Kolkata. I would now request you, sir, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bhattacharya, further and offer her the virtual dais.
On behalf of Geological Institute, Presidency University, I welcome you, Dr. Atreyee Bhattacharya. Dr. Atreyee Bhattacharya is a paleoclimatologist by profession. She studies the nature, causes, and socioeconomic impacts of climate variability in semi-arid climate hotspots of the global south. Dr. Bhattacharya completed BSc from the very own Presidency College, Kolkata. Following, she finished her master's degree from IIT Kharagpur in 2005. She pursued her Ph.D. from Harvard University in 2012. Dr. Bhattacharya is currently a research faculty at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She is also a visiting research scientist at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, University of California, San Diego, and adjunct faculty member at the Department of Social Studies and Humanities at the IIIT Delhi. She is also member of the National Association of Science Writers. Dr. Bhattacharya has co-led the development of a new paradigm, social geosciences, which I personally will be very happy and interested in listening to some part of it, definitely. And she has participated in a wide range of educational and non-governmental outreach efforts focused on climate communications, climate literacy, and climate adaptation. She has produced several scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals and participated in different conferences. Today, her topic of lecture will be Chronicling Climate, where she will be focusing on the reconstruction of climate variability and its impact of the late Holocene using high-resolution proxies from different natural and human archives. And to be very precise, this topic will be of really important and it will be enriching us on the wake of this climate crisis which we are facing and which is unavoidable. The recent IPCC reports, which we are all aware about, that which is predicting in the coming decades, the kind of climatic variability, climatic crisis, which we all will be facing, and all humanity are on the on the edge of this climatic doom. And in this position, archives of paleoclimate and deciphering them is of real importance, because without the study of paleoclimate, we really, as society, cannot predict where we are heading into or what will be our steps to mitigate those problems. And so, with these words, I welcome Dr. Bhattacharya to deliver a lecture.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. And I don't know if I can talk about everything. Certainly, I cannot talk about social geosciences today because that's an entirely different thing. But hopefully, I can touch upon some of those things. So how should we proceed? Just share the screen and such things? Okay. Okay. Hold on. Let me see. Desktop window. Yes. Okay. So can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, yes, thank you. All right. So this is just a fancy name for chronicling climate. The chronicle means a continuous record of climate. And I am at the series, we call it Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, Center for Asian Studies, and the Department of Civil Engineering, Environment, and Architectural Engineering. That's a mouthful. So yeah, so, oh God, okay. So we started this century, as your professor mentioned, we started this century on a hopeful note, really. We knew that climate was warming up, and we hoped at that point, this was the first IPCC report, that we would be able to sort of stabilize our climate at about 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the cool box. But the path we were on clearly indicated that we were heading into a very, very warm Earth. This was the hope that by the end of the century, or actually by sort of the inflection point right here, we'd be able to sort of stabilize the global average at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that was very simply that, you know, all kinds of scientists, not just climate scientists, environmental scientists, economists, everyone sort of came together and figured out that the impacts, the negative, and those would be negative and negative because our humanity hasn't seen such dramatic changes. And with every degree or every quarter of a degree of warming, we are going to see increasingly stronger impacts, all of them really negative for us and all species on Earth. And and scientists figured this out early on, that if we could limit our warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius, we could manage the fallouts in a reasonable way. Anything more than that would be catastrophic, as in terms of socioeconomic impacts of that. So, and that's related not just to temperature, but also to strong feedbacks that happen when you warm up the Earth this fast, this much. And this includes precipitation. This includes pretty much everything. So, and a large reason for that are greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and methane, and some other forms which causes warming at the surface of the Earth. And all of this is anthropogenic. So today so I want to show you, this is the latest IPCC reports atlas. And the atlas shows pretty much any variable that you'd like to check. And also the degree of warming, And also you can select uncertainties. I've selected none just for ease of presentation. So what we have is sort of, if you look at minimum temperatures, we are quickly warming the world, much more at the polar regions and much less at the tropics, because polar regions have ice albedo feedback, which causes these impacts, the warming, to amplify fairly rapidly. If we look at maximum temperature, for example, you can look at all these variables. I'm just pointing some of them out. We're going to have increasing maximum temperatures. and a host of those things. If we just look at a few other ones, total precipitation, you see major changes in precipitation, a vast amount of precipitation over the warm oceans, simply because the warm oceans attract or suck out the moisture from the land. So you can play around with this. There's a lot of information here that you can seek, different regions. But basically what this means is that we're going to have extreme events, wildfires, dust storms, and obviously flooding and droughts and all of those, which will impact sort of the ecology. Remember that, I don't know if you've read in class, that biology can evolve at when the change in temperature is about 1 degree Celsius over 1 million years. That's when everything can adapt smoothly. But we're changing it in a matter of decades. It's really, really fast, 1,000 times faster than what the ecology and the biology can adapt, and also what we can adapt to, despite feeling that we have technology and therefore we can deal with it. I think it's just a misnomer and a false sense of security that only makes problems even more dramatic. In particular to India, I think what we want to be, this is the record from Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, the only climate institute really in the country, run by the Ministry of Earth Sciences. It's a federal facility. And here you see changes in a scale that matters to us in a more immediate kind of a way. So what we see is that, this is a monsoon country, this is a monsoon zone, this is the one thing that ties not just India, but all of South Asia. And you can see we are expecting different amounts of precipitation in June, increasing in June and August, and really reducing in July and September. And that is very, very important when you start thinking about water use, water management. This is a Google Earth image in peninsular India, where a rain-fed distributary of a river in Maharashtra has been dammed in order to conserve water for supplying water to all of these agricultural plots of land around the neighborhood. And this has implications for who gets to water, what determines access to water, and what happens as a result of that kind of conflict. This is a lake bed that we were going to core. There was water in here. And on the day that we had gone to core this lake, the water had been sucked dry and put into dug wells around, intended for sugarcane. Now, you're in Bengal, so you know sugarcane is a tropical plant. It requires about 1,800 millimeters of rainfall a year. This is semi-arid regions of Maharashtra, where you get about 300 to 600 millimeters of rainfall. And there's a tremendous rush for sugarcane production because it fetches very high values in the market. So these are examples of the dug wells that I was just talking about. And all of these, the water that we use today and is fed by rainwater is not just used for drinking or agriculture, it's also used for subsistence kind of farming. Here we see fishermen kind of using this water body for fish farming. And then during the summer times, when the riverbeds and lake beds run dry, this is the water used for pretty much cleaning, drinking water supply, and all of it. Clearly, the top picture should give you a pause thinking about the health impacts of dwindling water supplies. This is Maharashtra do a lot of the work. And you can see that all of these regions are converting from sort of their indigenous varieties of crops into more water-thirsty crops like sugarcane and rice, because they fetch a high enough value in the market, which allows people to not just live lives, but also deal with the sort of social norms of the region. This warming climate and changing precipitation patterns, soil moisture, and extreme events have all impacts on a crop calendar that is changing rapidly in response to market force with no heed to the climate realities. So I hope what I'm able to show you is that all of these factors which cascades from warming temperatures to strong feedbacks into other extreme events and long-term changes, really starts impacting human society very, very quickly. This includes migration of people from rural areas to urban areas, management of resources in urban areas, and the larger question of how do we feed a world if farmers are not going to be able to produce food and live in the regions that they live. So, in fact, a new study, not a new study, but this was one of the studies that kind of shed light on this problem, that even in a 2 degrees Celsius warming world, this is the population distribution that we have today, or in 2016, you can see our country sort of burning bright. Even in response to 2 degrees Celsius warming, we could expect large, long distance, more than 500 kilometers warming. So, really, if we have to think about why we should care, I mean, other than thinking of a doomsday, I think the idea is that the impact of climate can be threefold. There are extremes, there are hazards, usually those two go hand in hand, and then long-term changes, all of which feed into the basic agrarian pattern defined by biophysical effects on plant growth, human and animal health. And once you start impacting this agrarian pattern, we know that there are economic feedbacks, there are demographic feedbacks. I just talked to you about both of those. And then eventually that leads into some kind of political feedback. Now, the arrows are much straighter. The process is much more complicated, but generally giving you a conceptual model of understanding these kinds of interactions. So one of the things that we want to do is that, given that we are already witnessing major impacts on socioeconomic structures around the world and political structures around the world, here is an example of how much, putting a dollar value, so to speak, on some of these disasters. Droughts are going to be the leading cause of disaster, followed by floods, and then other meteorological temperatures and storms, and then biological disasters such as diseases, infestations, most of them linked to temperatures because that is related to the tolerance temperature, and then wildfires. So if you put this all together, you can pretty much see a colossal impact of climate and climate-related impacts, most so felt in Asia, which is basically the place where food for the whole world is grown, followed by Africa and Latin America. So as we heard in the introduction, that understanding not just how climate has varied, but also sort of understanding how humanity has responded to extremes as well as variability gives us a baseline to understand our real exposure to what we don't think of in many ways in our everyday life. And which is why I think the idea that chronicling climate is not just chronicling the physical changes, but also kind of mapping on human impacts, if possible, onto sort of these climate records or chronicles of climate, and really assessing what are some of our, what is the true nature of vulnerability? Is it consistent with what we expect, that we are only vulnerable to extreme events, or are we far more vulnerable to long-term fluctuations than we perhaps appreciate? So before we get into climate, just some concepts are quite important. They're very basic. But remember, pressure and temperature are proportional. Back in the day when I was in Presidency College, a lot of my classmates and peers would come to earth sciences because they thought that was the only science that you could study without mathematics. It was very bizarre at that time. And it's very bizarre now, but if that is in any way, shape, or form the prevailing hypothesis today, I suggest that you don't have that. Take your math classes seriously, because otherwise, you are at a loss as to what you can do with the observations. So some things important for climatology that we always take into account: pressure and temperature are, directly proportional. Solubility on gases basically go down with increasing temperature. So, and these are all real gases, we know that, ideal gases. So their behavior is pretty much like this one, that when you have warming temperatures, gas is less soluble. So when you have increasing ocean temperatures, lake temperatures, not only do you reduce the amount of dissolved oxygen, but also the carbon held in cooler waters is released because it cannot be held in warmer waters. So once you start warming the ocean, which we have done so far, and I just showed you a few examples from the IPCC report, basically the surface ocean starts releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere, and the deep ocean, which is a huge inventory of dissolved carbon, starts getting released. And therefore you see how important feedback mechanisms are in climate, and they're very strong feedbacks. And one of the things that I do want to say is that we are well past 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's never going to happen again. Our best efforts put us at 2.7 degrees Celsius. That's the best if we did everything we could together, and that's already a dream. And also, I think what we want to know is that so we are well past that 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of or middle of the century. Although the recent, this COP26 that happened last week basically said that if we cannot do 1.5 degrees Celsius, we should be prepared to, adapt in one of the most extreme situations that humanity has ever witnessed. So solubility of gases, and the third important thing is climate is a measure of atmospheric conditions in a region, and that's heavily influenced by the ocean, especially the surface ocean. But it's a measure of atmospheric conditions. So if you have read in class that climate is weather is variable, climate is constant, that's wrong. Climate is not constant. It is a long-term. It is variable. And the idea that climate is constant clearly comes from a Victorian idea of climate, when colonialists staying in Europe were used to a very stable extratropical kind of climate. And the idea of dynamic climate is really just a few decades old. So climate is not constant. It is just a measure of atmospheric conditions in a region over a long time. And it does vary. And it has different kinds of variation associated, some of which are, quite long, some of which are quite short, and therefore there are these quasi-cycles that we have in the climate system, regional climate, global climate, however you want to say. And anytime we change climate, the variability responds to that external pressure. Okay. So very quickly, then solar energy drives climate. It's called climate forcing. The energy is most intense at the equator and is distributed by ocean and the atmosphere towards regions. And almost 50% is, scattered or reflected out before it reaches the surface. And then once it does, it gets converted. It's a black body radiation, so it gets converted into long wave radiation. And then, a number of processes, some of them get out of the Earth atmosphere system, and then some of it gets trapped by these greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, N2O, H2O, because of their unique molecular structure. And this is called the greenhouse effect. Without the greenhouse effect, I should let you know that the Earth's temperature would have been a -3 degrees Celsius cold. Rather, it's an average 15 degrees Celsius warm. So greenhouse has kept the planet habitable for billions of years. So greenhouse is just an effect. However, as we increase the concentrations of these trace gases, it does have a huge impact on how much heat, how much of this radiation gets trapped and does not get out. And therefore, that causes this warming that we are talking about. But when we think about the insulation absorbed by land, atmosphere, and oceans, it's not, again, just absorbed as in like a very simplistic figure that I showed you. It basically has these different reservoirs, right, which are expressed in gigatons of carbon. And there are fluxes, so these exchange between one another. So these are gigatons per year. And you can see that the number is, say, for example, it has an inventory of 900 gigatons. And then it exchanges with the deep ocean as well as the atmosphere. And each of these exchanges happen at a certain time scale and at a certain rate. heat and mass through these different reservoirs, you have what, and these, as you can imagine, these are very, very complex processes. And therefore, the fluctuations, the variability that you see in a climate system is pretty much reflective of these exchanges as well as the forcing. So there are two components which cause climate to fluctuate. One is changing the amount of incoming radiation. If you, for example, let's see, yes. So climate variability is defined as any kind of variation in the average climate measured at scales greater than weather events. And these can occur because of external forcing that changes the amount of solar radiation received by the surface of the Earth. And these are called Melancholic cycles. I'm sure you've studied in class that the Earth's orbit changes its shape, as well as the degree of tilt changes, and all of these change the amount of incoming solar radiation, giving rise to different kinds of Melancholic cycles, which have different timescales of variability: 100,000 years, 41,000 years, 23,000 years. And there are other things which, for example, are more about internal variability that I just mentioned, this exchange of mass and temperature. And that gives rise to other kinds of variability like millennial, centennial, multi-decadal, and even decadal. Some of the things that we have been, that behavioral scientists seem to kind of indicate is that decadal variability is one that influences societal decisions the most, even when individuals are not reacting to that sense of variability at all. So another thing, so there is climate variability, climate forcing, and all of that. And then the last thing that is important as a concept is that there are sometimes an abrupt climate change, some abrupt event. And that happens because of these strong feedbacks that I was just talking about. So, so very strong feedbacks can often result in a small change driving a major event. For example, a sudden release in methane that happened just before the Holocene, which is this period of climate stabilization, we call it. And that happened because of methane release that took place in 10 years, changing the Earth's climate very permanently, at least as permanently as human beings are concerned. So this is the Holocene, 10,000 years, the period of climate stabilization. Towards the end of the Holocene, we see this little ice age when temperatures cool down. There are several theories about it. Internal variability seems to be the most important one. Scientists for a while played around with the idea that there were sunspot activities that could have changed the ice age to the solar. So summarizing, climate variability is established frequencies or modes of variation, and are usually longer than timescales of mixing between atmosphere and upper ocean, which is of the order of seasonal. And then abrupt events will often impact this natural order and could reestablish a new pattern, or at least superimpose on that existing pattern. So a lot of this, chronicling climate really is not just measuring climate, but also really understanding the statistics behind it to establish cyclicity and therefore causality. Chronicle of climate is typically direct measurements. These are from instruments, rain gauge, satellites, and even more fancier instruments that we have today across the world. Before 1950s, we had historical measurements. Some of these were, thermometers. That was the earliest one, and then rain gauge sometime in the early 1800s. In India, the earliest rain gauge was in the city of Madras in 1813. And then before that, I guess, where we get into what earth scientists think about in terms of indirect measurements in natural and human archives. So I'm going to tell you of a particular thing that we do and how we chronicle climate. And then, yes. So there are three kind of things that we look for when we think about a climate record. We look for a trend, which shows there is a consistent increase or decrease for a substantial amount of time. There is also what is the underlying pattern of variability. And once you take those into account, what is an anomaly, which is, an anomaly is statistically defined as anything which is more than 3 standard deviations. And usually anomalies are difficult to get, because if you take the entire record, most of what the fluctuations we think about are not anomalous, but just a part of the variability, although human beings may perceive that variability as anomalous. So there are three things that we sort of look into a climate record. I particularly work with three kinds of climate archives. One is lake records, which I generate, corals, as well as historical documents and historical instruments. So I don't work with rocks or ocean sediments or any of that. And these are some just photographs where, this was in 2019 or 18 when we were last out in the field. So we take a boat and that's fitted with these kinds of coring device, and there are different kinds of coring device. This is, for example, a gravity corer. So you basically attach a weight and then you let it fall vertically into, once you are out in the middle of the lake, you know your location, where you want to do. I should mention that before we go coring, we do an in-depth bathymetry and using different lake geophysical techniques. So we have a very good understanding of facies, and we know where we want to plonk our corer so that we can get the longest record. So we go to a location and keep the boat steady and then deploy this. Sometimes we fool around. And then once we do that, we basically bring up these kinds of cores. So this is the top, this is closest to the surface of the lake, and then this is the bottommost. So typically lakes, particularly in semi-arid regions, they have about 1 to 2 meters of core materials that we can get. It can have up to 6 meters, but fairly rare. But we can easily get about 1 meter of sedimentation that can, depending on the sedimentation rate, can represent 100 to 1,000 years, depends on that particular setting. In some cases, when you think that there is water and there is no water, I showed you the picture before, we have to do something much more crude, is that we basically take our core to the location, and this is not fun because you are waist deep in the middle of like mud trying to put the coring device down. And this is how we do it. Some of us are, waist deep, some of us less so. And then we still manage to extract these long 1 meter cores, but we don't. And this was in the middle of the late month of May, and you can see the high lake stands at the back. So all of this water was taken out, and we basically had the entire lake surface to just go and get our cores. So, and once we do it, this shows sort of the top and the bottom. These are foams that we use to plug the top of the core because, these are transported, say, from somewhere in Maharashtra all the way to Minnesota and Colorado. So, these have to be packed very well. And then it's run through a bunch of different measurements, imaging, and then we select sort of the geochemical analysis, the biological, analysis, for example, they're not fossils technically, but assemblages, and then other things. So we have what we call a number of measurements which we know are reflective of erosional patterns or directly about, the difference between precipitation and evaporation, and create multi-proxy records that then can give you not just a sense of the climate, but also the behavior response of the environment to climatological changes, as well as ecological changes that happen as a response to climate variability in these settings. So natural archives are key to reconstructing climate variability, environmental response, as well as ecological response. And here is just a summary of all the different kinds of natural archives one can study. Here on the x-axis is resolution of records, which means how often can you collect an indirect observation given the nature of sedimentation and, not just sedimentation, also coral growth and tree rings grow and things like that. And this tells you the time span of record. And based on the kind of variability that you're interested in studying, you might want to choose some high resolution but relatively short time period. And by short, we mean 1,000 years. So it's not really very short. But if you wanted to study, say, the whole Holocene, then you would basically look at lakes, combination of all of these. And then if you want to study really deep time, exchanges of carbon and heat and other deep time, I guess you would start looking at sedimentary rocks. As I said, that I tend to concern myself with these guys right over here. So they're mostly the last 1,000 years, with a combination of coral reefs, lake sediments, tree rings. I specialize in, collecting samples from lakes as well as coral reefs. It's the same principle. And then, identifying historical documents as well as, instrumental records, and basically seeing how those things can help us chronicle climate. But also with a combination of human records, can it also help us understand the human impacts associated with climate variability? So before I talk about, so in the next part, I'm going to talk about, I think I was going to talk about 2 case studies, but I think I'll just talk about 1 at this point because we started half an hour late, so I won't have the time to talk about 2. So this part will be really about chronicling climate, but also chronicling the human impact of climate. So one thing, I talked a lot about climate impacts because of warming climate, but one thing we forget often is that human beings have always, human beings, human societies, human population has always interacted with climate. Here, for example, are sort of the early migrations of human beings. These numbers show you the earliest migration history from a place. And the red digits are basically different kinds of mutations or mtDNA mutations identified in different populations. And then the arrows indicate the direction of migration. So we had major phase of migration out of East Africa, where we know we all come from, at about 160,000 years ago. This is the major migration. And then you can see following these arrows that, this was Middle East, 50,000 years, and then younger phases of migration coming into different parts of the world. Here we have this one strand coming in, and that happened between 85 to 75,000 years, and then eventually went on to these other places. And one thing to note is that human population migrations are deeply tied, turns out, to wet and dry phases. Here is oxygen isotope record from the Vostok ice core, which is the longest continuous record of global temperatures. And you see these cycles. They're not all perfect. In some cases, they look quite perfect. Some cases, they don't. This is associated with changes in carbon dioxide, which basically responded to changes in insulation because of Melancholic cycles through feedback mechanisms. And what we find is that each of these migrations, large migrations, happen during phases of cold and dry. And the reason that cold and dry was important because it affected people's abilities to grow crops, or even before agriculture happened, it really changed the ecology of the region, so people could no longer hunt, gather, or subsist on forests, and would have to move places into other places. Also, during cold and dry, there would be less extreme events that allowed for easier migration. So all of these continued for a vast number of years, really, from 160 to about 10,000 years. And then this Holocene, which is a period of relative warmth and stabilization, and that's when you start seeing things like establishing of, agricultural centers. There are 3 major agricultural products: rice, wheat, and maize. And you can see that, starting from about early Holocene, 7,000 years, to about late Holocene, middle Holocene, different centers were activated, and we started conducting agriculture. And agriculture is the basis of ownership of land, formation of societies, civilizations, and eventually kingdoms and settlements, and eventually kingdoms, and then eventually administration. So agriculture and growing food and availability of food is the link that ties climate to human societies. Reminding you again that there are extremes, hazards, and long-term changes, all of which affect the basic agrarian pattern, which includes plant growth. And agrarian is not just, growing crops on plots of land. It's also thinking about forest resources, fish farming, other kinds of things. And then that basic agrarian pattern is what feeds into economics and then demography, and eventually political feedback. So I hope that in this part of the talk, I've been able to kind of understand the kind of connections. Usually these are very long conversations, but hopefully you've gotten a flavor of this thing. So the next thing that I'm going to do is present a recently published paper that explores this link between climate variability and food production, and what really is the threshold that human societies have tolerated, especially over the last, during the Little Ice Age and sort of the latest part of the Holocene, which is the Little Ice Age. So the title of that paper was basically Extreme Rain. We don't even need to be, in the domain of extreme rainfall deficits. We were basically looking at famines. So famines are an example of acute food shortages. And those terms are again coming back. We thought that at the end of the 19th century, we were done with the word famines, although there's some politics around it. But largely, we thought that at least since the middle of the 20th century, we've produced enough food in the world that we need not go hungry. Well, that's not true, because 65%, 65% of the world's population today lives in some form of malnutrition and hunger. So even though we produce a huge amount of food, we don't necessarily feed the world. And given climate impacts, the word famines are again coming back. So we're expecting acute food shortages, and we are already seeing that. So it behooves us to think about food shortages and climate variability. And the only way we can evaluate these things is not just by looking at models which predict the future, but at actual chronicles of climate that can help you evaluate these relationships. So the motivation was really to understand economic impacts associated with variability in semi-arid agroeconomies in the Indian subcontinent. And by semi-arid, we in Bengal don't kind of think about aridity as a major problem, at least not in Calcutta, but some of you may be coming from western parts of West Bengal, Purulia, and all of these. I myself am from Kharagpur, and we do know, what aridity is. But other than pockets of sort of, arid, semi-arid biomes or ecosystems, large parts of semi-arid ecosystems in India are in the southern part of the country, the peninsular part of the country. And you can see the climate models project that these regions are going to see a lot more reduction in rainfall than we see currently. And just to remind you that this is a certainty, given that we are no longer going to be able to stabilize climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius, no matter what the political talk around it is. And droughts are sort of the leading cause of economic sort of vulnerability in Asia, particularly in our country. And so the idea was to see, what happens what is the relationship between droughts, which are part of and climate variability, food production, and other impacts. The other thing, remember, is that most of the people who produce food, 80% to be specific, are smallholder farmers. They are not big farmers. They own less than 2 hectares of land, and therefore are extremely vulnerable to all kinds of direct and indirect influences, impacts of climate, as well as economics. So this is how the region looks like. That's the black soil from the Deccan Traps, very, very fertile for growing different kinds of crops. The bottleneck is precipitation in this region, not the soil quality. And usually the sources of water are these kinds of dams that was built from the mid 19th century. So these are Victorian structures that were used to conserve water in order to grow more water thirsty and cash crops like cotton and eventually sugarcane. And these sources again are also used for different other kinds of subsistence like fishing and fish farming. And these are different kinds of lake level stands in response to differing sort of, precipitation events that happen in the region. So again, kind of zoning in, this is sort of the dark warmer colors are, basically tells you annual average precipitation. That's a long-term average. And you can see the Western Ghats going parallel and trapping all of the moisture on the seaward side of it. And very little moisture sort of makes its way across the hills. And what you have is a really coast to interior kind of gradient in rainfall. And these are some old pictures that a news article that covered our publication kind of dug out, that these are the regions that basically saw a lot of famines, and famines, well documented for 200 years or so. Okay, so this gave us a really good sort of a structure that we have a place where we have good climate records, especially because these are some of the earliest precedent. Oh God, these are some of the. This is also a part of the Bombay Presidency and the Madras Presidency. So some of the oldest presidencies, and I just mentioned to you that the rain gauge data, earliest rain gauge data was from Madras City. So it gave us both the two things that we needed: a human archive for documenting food shortages, and the natural archives or instrumental archives for documenting climate variability independently. And therefore, one was not influencing other. We were not using one to reconstruct the other, but we were just kind of combining the two to see how those match up. And this is the National Archives of India, and there are colonial documents going from early 1700s all the way till mid 1950s. And the earlier ones were handwritten, and then the later ones a combination of handwritten and typed out. So these are archived here in the National Archives of India, New Delhi. There are also different kinds of archives across the country, not just the National Archives. We just use this, and also the southern part of the country is also where we have a bunch of high-resolution records like instruments, tree ring reconstructions, as well as speleothems or cave carbonates. So that gave us a really good, while we were reconstructing lake records here, but we needn't wait for that because there were already other climatological, and lake records are sort of climate aggregators. They're not necessarily climate, they also integrate environment and ecology. But tree rings, speleothems, they're very specific to recording precipitation. So we did have these two really interesting archives to look at, and we did just that. And we call this a longue duree approach because it's not really paleoclimate, because that really indicates more deeper time. But this is a longue duree. It's a social sciences term that we have borrowed. It's a long period of time during which social processes develop or social structures evolve. And this approach has very important implications for understanding social processes in the context of climate and environmental variability. And because climate varies on typically long time scales, 10 years or beyond, so an understanding of these interactions require an analysis of quote-unquote long records. We need both human and natural records. They should be high resolution, and several locations are needed to capture both local and regional information. So we applied this approach, longue duree. We have to say that we developed this in our group as a part of the social geosciences model, where societal sort of implications drive sort of the geological or the climatological approaches to choose from. And we wanted to assess economic vulnerability to climate variability. So we used 18th to 28th century British administrative documents housed in the Indian National Archives, as well as historical rain gauge record, tree ring reconstructions, and cave carbonates. And this region, again, this is not just important for our understanding, but it is important today because this is the largest rain-fed cash crop region in the country. and therefore quite vulnerable to impacts of climate variability. And it's not clear what exactly are the thresholds for those things. So this is a map of the Bombay presidency and the Madras presidency. You see that it basically encompasses a large parts of the semi-arid regions of peninsular India. And there are lots of documents that were unexplored before us that really recorded information about potential food shortages or famines. And this is the way we extracted the information. We took out a year, the region, the description of the climate, the problems faced. And these were all administrative documents. They're not personal diaries. They were intended to communicate between local administrations with headquarters about problems going on at district or taluk level. So the last thing was, what were the remedies suggested by local administrators, sometimes taken, sometimes not. But the entire discussions were basically letters and meeting minutes, all of which discussing the economics, the amount of money required to solve this problem. So this way we reconstructed really 1733 to 1947. That's when the colonial period ended. And an entire record of the region as well as climate, human impacts. And we found that there were several instances of both regional and local famines distributed across this region. Okay, so there were, and famines were typically described as crop failure, food scarcity, hike in grain prices, starvation, migration, slavery, riots, epidemic diseases, and death. A total of 22 known instances of such famines. Some were also confirmed by other authors, particularly Adamson, using British diaries, which are now housed in British archives in London, over 218 years. So the first thing we did was see how this famine record compares to historical instrumental records. This is a network of historical instrumentations available in the country. And we looked at the ones that are particular to these two Indian meteorological divisions that are closest representatives of the two presidencies. And this is how it stacked up. So what we found is that, so this is the wiggles here are basically the Z-score, the deviation from normal annual rainfall. And what we see are these regional famines in red, and then local famines in these gray circles. And then we also had, Adamson's work sort of wherever we found that, they also reported some of these famines independently in their publication. And what we found is that the threshold for famines was about 1 standard deviation from the normal. That's about 14 to 17%, depending on the presidency. So we found that 14 to 17% rainfall reduction, that's just about 1 standard deviation, was the threshold at which people started feeling the impacts of the fluctuation. In fact, severely enough to cause famines. Okay, so this was one example. The second thing that we did was basically look at 3 tree ring records. They were all sort of here. And those are the 3 records, and they go back to early 1800s. And we found the same thing, that it's a different archive. And we found that basically at that 1 standard deviation, and thinner tree rings represent drier conditions, thicker tree rings represent, more moisture. And we found the same thing over again. There were some instances of local famines that seemed to be, happening even when rainfall reductions, there were no rainfall reductions, some local famines. However, remember that tree rings are here and local famines. So the tree rings may not reflect the local conditions in certain areas. So, and that's almost always true. We cannot get tree ring record from every single locality. So that explains some of these outliers, but there were only a couple of outliers in our record. And the last thing we did was sort of look at this in a climatological context. So the other two were mostly meteorological. This is the curve here is oxygen isotopes of cave carbonates. Now remember, cave carbonates are basically carbonates that form from drip waters, and therefore thicker, higher values represent wetter conditions and lower values represent drier conditions. And what we found is that, and this kind of goes back a longer time, the entire part of the record. In fact, the particular speleothem record by Sinha et al. Goes back the whole millennium, I believe. We just took a part of what was important. And this is from the Jhumar cave. This is the location right outside the boundaries of the Madras Presidency. This is the only high resolution record that we have. And what we have found is that famines return every 5 to 10 years. Warmer periods appear to have more such instances of fluctuation, and the relationship between and one of the things that stood out was that warmer phases tended to have these sort of deviations much more frequently, and therefore could explain some of the occurrences of famines associated with an overall warming period, but larger number of fluctuations. But even that fluctuation was not that much, or was within the expected variability of climatic conditions in the region. So some of the conclusions, only one. So we talk about extreme events and our vulnerability to extreme events. Turns out that we don't have to go all the way to extreme events. Conditions where sometimes we are not even resilient to normal kind of rainfall variability, and the reason is because we tend to ignore the climatic realities and go with the market realities, and then eventually that puts us at a larger disadvantage. There's a return period of famines every 5 to 10 years, consistent with decadal climate variability, typically El Nino, southern oscillations, and associated land atmospheric feedbacks. And then warmer periods tended to see more instances of rainfall variability and associated famines. So how does this study compare to what we're seeing today? So this is the 20th century all the way till 2020. And what we find is that, yes, we continue to have rainfall reductions continuously. And this is etched in Maharashtrian farmers, if you go and talk to them, as the biggest drought. Indeed it is. It's almost an anomaly, given that this is almost 3 standard deviation away. This is an extreme event. There are other examples. So extreme events we see are increasing today. And we also see these instances of extreme events associated with droughts and food shortages. We don't necessarily have food shortages today because railways and other means of distributing food has improved because of the Green Revolution and other things. However, there are different kinds of vulnerabilities in the system that, for example, migration is one big thing. So droughts and impacts continue with normal variability. And then technology, water infrastructure, transport, food storage, better access to markets may have prevented food scarcity and death, but it has brought to light something else associated with human migration away from rural centers into urban centers. So the word famine may not appear today. After 1901, the word famine largely disappeared from administrative documents. After 1970s, it also disappeared from policy documents by Indian scholars. And it has again come back from the United Nations because of growing food scarcity around the world. And some of those food scarcity may not necessarily reflect water conditions, but also personnel who find it difficult to grow crops in a variable climate, more fluctuating climate, more extreme events, and therefore tend to migrate away from cities. We have completely, so SAR societies are vulnerable to minor fluctuations in climate. British socioeconomic policies were not cognizant of climate variability, nor are we today. Minor climate triggers can lead to large-scale socioeconomic impacts. And a lesson for us today is that we expect more extreme events and more climate variability. So this, I hope, this kind of study gives the important threshold and cautionary note that we need for planning purposes. I had a different one about population migration in this region, but I'm not going to talk about it. We're all out of time. So with that, I will take questions. Thank you very much. And I hope to end with this acknowledgement slide. Lots of people were involved in thinking about different aspects. And lots of funding agencies were involved in this. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I will take some questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this enriching lecture and an interesting one of that. I would like to ask Dr. Bhattacharya for some time as our team is compiling these questions.
Sure.
On a different note, we have a very important announcement to make. On 27th of November, Dr. Supriya Chakraborty, a senior scientist and the head of the mass spectrometry group and the Medflux India project at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, will be delivering a very fascinating talk on determination of carbon sourcing characteristics of forest ecosystem. All relevant details will be up on our social media handles very soon. Kindly follow us to receive updates. We request your valuable presence and participation on that day.
Yes, and Supriya is also a collaborator on this work.
Okay, we shall now take the questions we have received from the participants to the speaker. The first question is from Shom Banerjee, Presidency University. How effective and accurate is the lacustrine sediment coring method for recording climate variability?
It's pretty accurate, but there's an uncertainty, obviously. But well-dated cores can often give you an uncertainty of less of a year. It depends on the setting, really. For example, there are some lakes that are anoxic and therefore there's less disturbance. Some regions that I work in Maharashtra sees a lot of flood events. So it's not a blanket statement of yes and no, but I think good dates and different kinds of dates. One, we had to figure out whether we could date using carbon date. We found that the combination of cesium-137 and carbon dates can be helpful. But yeah, I think it really depends on the setting and as well as the dating techniques one should be exploring. But if one is able to date these cores well, then I think the uncertainties are less than 30%, could be as good as 10% even.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Priyantan Gupta, IIT Kharagpur. Ma'am, can you tell about the sampling process for coral reef? What kind of samples is preferable for paleoclimate analysis?
Hold on. Coral sediment. So we put together a short video for coral sedimentation, and the process is pretty much the same. That you dive down. So corals typically grow. There are deep sea corals that grow about 2.5 kilometers below. But the standard kind of hermatypic corals are usually 50 meters below the water surface. And what we do is we basically take an underwater drill or pretty much like a tree ring, or I showed you the lake coring, and then plug it with a specialized cement so that the colony is not disturbed. So that's how you extract. We made a video for students. Hold on, I will drop it in the chat box so you can take a look at it. But that's pretty much the methodology. I dropped it in the chat box. You can check it out. And again, the question about which is good, I think I talked about it. Depending on the question or the variability from there. So it depends on the question, really. Are we still on? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. There's another question from Shubhadeep Roy, Presidency University. In geological terms, the recent climate disturbance has taken place really fast, especially since the Industrial Revolution. Can anything practical be done anthropologically to mitigate this rapid shift?
Well, I think the way to think about this is, the answer is yes and no. The amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere is going to need to be drawn down. And through natural processes, that's going to take whatever is in. So if we stopped everything today, even whatever is in the atmosphere will need 20 to 30,000 years to be drawn down by natural processes. There is a significant interest in carbon store capture as a technology, and that's being explored. The other things are sort of, carbon capture, carbon carbon credits, and all of those things. So sort of using renewable energy. So those are things people should be doing anthropologically, and the sense is moving away from fossil fuel. As societies, I think we should very quickly adapt or think about means of protecting people from the almost certain fallouts that we are witnessing, even while these things work itself out. So anthropologically, yes, we need to move very, very quickly into renewable energy. We could also include policies that reward companies that don't emit, or reward households that shift into renewable energy use. We need to think about how we're using water. We need to think about what kind of water usage are we moving into, particularly from a cropping perspective. And then I think at an individual level, we all need to think about carbon footprints. What's the car we are driving? What's our energy use? Where is our energy coming from? Where is our water coming from? Where's our source of food? Is it meat? So meat-intensive food tends to have a high impact in terms of carbon emission as well as water usage. So kind of moving to a more plant-based diet is also something that we at an individual level can do as societies to sort of contribute to the larger efforts that are being led technologically and at a sort of a policy level.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I think Nirupam is facing some internet problem. So I would like to ask Mr. Abhinav Roy, sir, to please, if he can unmute himself and can ask the question.
Yeah, I first thank you very much for the excellent talk, and more political, I think, and also economic aspect. I think your time is also nearly my time. I am in California, and I just wanted to learn that about the pedology is not much mentioned in this one, because soil science gives have a lot of contribution in the study of the climate changes. I would have been very happy if you could enlighten a little bit. And also, the second point is the climate change. It is all due to inherent indigenous Earth processes and added by these anthropogenic processes, or there is also something from outside, I mean, the extraterrestrial effects?
Oh, well, I don't know about extraterrestrial. I did talk about solar insolation changes as climate forcing. The two mechanisms. One is increasing trapping of heat, and the other is increasing solar radiation. But beyond that, I would not think there is anything extraterrestrial in this. As regards soil moisture, that's very critical because there are four kinds of droughts, right? One is meteorological, one is hydrological, one is soil moisture, and one is socioeconomic droughts. So a large part of this is about, thinking about soil moisture retention and all of this, of which I have no expertise and I do not collaborate with anyone, but it is quite important. I completely agree.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am. For the next question, we have Mr. Shoura Bharto. He has sent you heartfelt gratitude for this wonderful talk. And he has asked that, can you please elaborate a little bit on the robustness of the extrapolation of local events on a global scale?
There's no need to extrapolate. In fact, I would suggest that there is the idea is the word is not extrapolate, but you would like to get instances of local events and see how that map onto sort of global reconstructions, and that way you get a very good understanding of what we call downscaling in climate, which basically means if we have a global event, how does it percolate down to the local level? And that's the most important one because that's where human beings make decisions. So I would rather go the other way around, that I would never try to extrapolate it. I would think of a local event, reconstruct it in its local setting, and then see how it relates to the global or the regional event, and that gives a better clarity on thinking about these feedback systems that I've been talking about. That how does a regional event or a global event basically translate into a local event? At which point it becomes really what societies respond to. So I would not try to extrapolate, but I would try to map it on and see how those things play out.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Ma'am, do you have some time to take 2 or more questions?
Yes, I'm happy to take a couple of more questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. So for the next question, we have Mr. Debarun Mukherjee from Presidency University, and he has asked, what are the various ways and scientific techniques and proposal pitching skills that we should keep in mind while preparing our research proposals in climate change that may sound enticing enough for prospective sponsors and not just the usual, we are running out of water and all gonna die way?
I'm going to. That's a very interesting question. Let's. The idea is to really figure out the local context and what the organization or the funding agency is interested in, and that in itself is a research. For example, for our work, we got funding from very different kinds. Something that NSF kind of thing, that or DST that does very fundamental science, as well as from think tanks. And we had to pitch sort of the same idea, but we had to figure out what was interesting, what was the funding agency trying to fund, what were their objectives, and sort of see whether the objectives that we were interested in, sort of lined up, and how best to pitch it. So there's no silver bullet here, honestly. Yeah, it's a lot of thinking about I cannot tell you what will be exciting. It's very different for different calls, different agencies, different problems. And I think what you need to do is do your own research, discuss with different stakeholders, and then take time to draft a proposal and get input into that proposal from as many people as you could before you submit it. That would be my general advice. Sorry, it's not very specific.
No, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. For the next question, we have Shubhodip Mukherjee from Presidency University. He has asked, ma'am, you mentioned little ice age events and that they are exception events. So in a similar vein, are there also instances of mini global warming events? And also adding to this, what is the resolution of the data recorded in sediment cores just how detailed is it in comparison to speleothems and tree ring records?
Well, first and foremost, there's no reason to compare things. The speleothems give you very much a moisture budget, so it's a very climatological archive. On the other hand, lakes are integrators of climate and environment. And their deposition patterns, again, are very different from in different settings. Some of them can have annual depositions, some of them can have large depositions, some of them could be in flood-prone areas. It very much depends, which is why when I showed you that figure about lakes, it can be very high resolution to very coarse resolution, could be very short to very long. So that's one thing. There's, again, the point is which is better is really a question of no use. It really is about the question and how best to use the information. Not just it, but mostly erosional rates, water quality, which no other archive can give you. It's basically called a climate aggregator. So that's one thing. What was the other question about? Sorry, I forgot the first part of the question.
Yes, ma'am. You mentioned little ice age events and that they're exception events. So in a similar vein, are there also instances of mini global warming events?
Yes, you could Google the word hyperthermals. These were short bursts of release of large quantities of methane that cause sporadic bursts of warming. And these are much deeper in time, but you can there are certainly those events which are called hyperthermals, which are basically release of large amounts of potent greenhouse gas, methane, which is 237 times more stronger than carbon dioxide, that caused spurts of warming that during the ice age and even beyond. So yes, there are examples of that.
Thank you, ma'am. For the next question, we have two similar questions from Shagmeet Ghosh and Shrujata Majhi. They're asking that, ma'am, is there any trend that famines are more frequent in tropical countries than in temperate latitudes? If yes, then is it due to just climate change, or do socio-political events have major roles to play in it?
Of course, I mean, famines are completely a socioeconomic phenomenon that are precipitated because of lack of either interest or awareness or understanding of climate variability. So, which is why I said a small change, which is 14%, which is within one standard deviation. So the way to think about that is how vulnerable is a specific socioeconomic apparatus to variabilities in the climate system. So yes, famines are definitely a product of a socioeconomic phenomenon that becomes quite problematic when climate fluctuates, because you're assuming something will never change. And when it does change, the entire system is thrown into a tizzy. So that's the connection. So the way to think about this is not that, there's no way to say that famines are a climatic phenomenon. In fact, far from it. But what it does tell you is that our socioeconomic apparatus is not resilient to even small fluctuations, which is a part of normal variability of climate. That's the way to think about it.
Thank you, ma'am. As we are all bound to time, so we will take two more questions before we end this session. So the next question is from Mr. Onit Buiddo. He has asked, ma'am, one way to avoid disaster is to build resilience towards the disasters. Does the human records provide any information on resilience practices?
It does. Definitely does. Not just colonial documents, but there are other, not so much in our country, because our country relies a lot on oral tradition, not on written documentation. But there are lots of records that basically demonstrate, instances of how societies adapted to or built resilience to disasters, particularly Middle Eastern societies. And one of the key things that come out of that research is that understanding water conservation is key to success, or key to resilience in fairly harsh climatic conditions. there's a branch of study called environmental archaeology. You should look it up. There are plenty of instances of that in that literature.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. And for the last question, we have Bishash. She is asking, how can we plan crop production keeping in mind the climate data of a certain region so that famines can be controlled?
The question is simple. The answer is like a whole department or a huge body of work. For example, in Colorado, this is a conversation that's happening that, what is how to integrate a crop calendar with sort of climate projections and understanding of climate risks, paying attention to both sowing season, harvesting season, and all of those, and planting season. So it's not a very simple thing. It takes basically lots of components about understanding climate risks, vulnerability to the components of the climate system, not just average temperature, average precipitation, but onset of monsoon, number of dry days, number of wet days, all of these instances. So this is a work that is being done currently a lot in the United States. I'm not aware of any such work in our country, but this would have to be. I work very closely with Gaurav Arora at IIIT Delhi. He's an ag economist. So, it's basically climate modeling, climatologists, economists, sociologists, KVKs, Krishi Vikas Kendras, all basically working together. So one of the things that we do in social geosciences, which I did not talk about, is basically go into the community and stakeholders and talk to them to figure out the key areas of concern, and then see how long records or analysis can help address those. But that will not answer the question you do. It's just a small addition. It's a small step in the right direction, we believe. But these are done at federal lab levels and things like that. So very complex, but very important.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have received a huge number of questions, which we couldn't compile all due to the time constraint. So thank you for all the answers and the time that you gave us. It really enlightened us a lot. So now I would like to call Disha for the thank you speech. Disha.
Thank you, Ritanuka. A very good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Geological Institute, Presidency University, I would like to thank Dr. Atreyee Bhattacharya ma'am for this amazing session. It is not every day that we find the opportunity to learn from such an eminent personality. We express heartfelt gratitude for taking out time for us from her busy schedule. We sincerely hope that we'll be able to meet very soon and keep in touch for such effective sessions and workshops in future. It would be very kind of you to visit the department if you happen to find yourself in Kolkata. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank all the participants as well as technical hands for making this session successful. Before you leave, I would request you all to turn on your cameras for a while so that we can take a screenshot to preserve the moment. Please turn on your cameras. Done?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Done.
Thank you, ma'am. Let's call it for today. Good night.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, bye.